Now, one of the biggest traps people fall into after heartbreak is this desperate search for closure, as if the person who broke them is somehow responsible for putting the pieces back together, as if the same hands that dropped you are supposed to lift you again. But a high-value woman doesn't wait around for that moment of explanation. She doesn't sit by the phone hoping for some magical text that will finally make all the pain make sense. She understands something deeper, something most people avoid because it's hard. It's that closure isn't given. It's not a conversation or an apology or a revelation that lands in your lap one quiet night. Closure is built inside, piece by piece, often in silence, often alone. When the emotions are raw and loud, it's tempting to reach outward, to want someone else to untangle the knots inside you. But she knows that's not where real healing comes from. That's where dependency comes from. And she's too aware, too grounded to be held hostage by that. She sits with the ache, not because she enjoys the pain, but because she respects the process. She gives herself the dignity of feeling everything, the confusion, the anger, the loss, not suppressing it or rushing it, but actually learning from it, because that's what heartbreak really is. It's not just the end of a relationship. It's a mirror. It reflects what you were willing to accept. It shows you where you abandon yourself to keep someone else comfortable. And while most people run from that reflection, she doesn't. She looks straight into it. And when she does, she doesn't flinch. She sees her flaws. She sees the things she ignored, the red flags she painted white, the nights she quieted her intuition just to avoid conflict. She doesn't shame herself for it, but she doesn't deny it either. There's power in that kind of honesty. It doesn't feel like power in the beginning. At first it feels like weakness. Vulnerability always does. But in time, that willingness to face the truth without dramatizing it, that's where strength is born. That's how clarity sharpens. And with clarity comes freedom. Not freedom from the memory of the person, but freedom from needing them to make sense of what happened. That's real detachment. That's real maturity. And you'll see it play out in small, quiet ways. She'll stop rereading old messages, not because she forced herself to, but because they no longer hold emotional weight. She'll stop checking his social media, not because someone told her to, but because she genuinely doesn't care anymore. She stops fantasizing about what could have been and starts rooting herself in what is. And what is this. It ended. It hurt, but it taught her something, and that lesson is now a part of her, stitched into her resilience. This is a woman who will cry in private if she needs to, who will journal at 3 a.m. because her mind won't stop racing, who will take long walks just to find her footing again. But she won't lose herself. She won't crumble in the face of rejection, because her worth isn't attached to whether or not someone could see it. Her value doesn't drop because someone mishandled it. And even if she gave too much, even if she stayed too long, she doesn't let that define her next chapter. She lets it refine it. And over time, something incredible happens. She starts feeling light again, not because someone else picked her up, but because she let go of the weight herself, the weight of needing answers, the weight of trying to change what already happened, the weight of tying her identity to someone else's inability to love her well. That's not her burden anymore, and it never should have been. See, it's not that she doesn't feel pain. It's that she doesn't let it become her personality. She's too wise for that. Too aware that pain is a visitor, not a tenant. It passes through, but it doesn't get to redecorate the whole house. It doesn't get to shape how she shows up for herself moving forward. And because of that, she walks differently, talks differently, loves differently. She doesn't need to announce her healing. She lives it in the way she no longer reacts, in the way she's calm when confronted with chaos, in the way she smiles again, not because she's pretending everything is fine, but because she actually is fine. That's what happens when you stop chasing closure from someone else and start building it from within. You stop looking back. You stop reaching out. You stop waiting for validation. You stand up, you dust yourself off, and you become the kind of woman who no longer needs to be chosen because she already chose herself. And that right there is when she becomes unforgettable. You see, when a high-value woman walks through heartbreak, something inside her shifts. The emotional chaos might swirl around her like a storm, but she doesn't lose her center. In fact, it's often in that storm that she discovers how steady she really is. And what becomes very clear very quickly is that she no longer feels the need to chase anyone's attention. That old impulse, the one that told her to reach out, to over-explain, to fix what's already broken, it's gone. Not because the desire for connection disappears, but because her relationship with herself starts to take precedence. The deeper she leans into that, the less she tolerates anything that disrupts her peace. And this is where people get confused. They think detachment is bitterness. They think silence is coldness. But in reality, it's discipline. A high-value woman has learned that her energy is sacred. She's not stingy with it. She's selective. She no longer sends paragraphs hoping for half-hearted responses. She doesn't replay conversations in her head trying to decode hidden meanings. She doesn't manipulate outcomes or hold on to threads of hope. Why? Because she's tasted the clarity that comes when you stop seeking validation in places where love was never stable to begin with. You have to understand, attention is cheap. It's everywhere. Clicks, likes, texts, these are all easy to give. But presence, consistency, loyalty, those are rare. And when you go through heartbreak, when you've been gutted by someone who once swore they'd never leave, you start to realize how little attention is actually worth without intention behind it. She learns this the hard way, but she learns it well. And once she does, she doesn't spend another ounce of energy begging to be seen. She's not trying to prove her worth anymore. She's living it in how she carries herself, in the boundaries she sets, in the conversations she doesn't entertain anymore. She's no longer interested in impressing anyone who made her feel like she was too much or not enough. That internal tug of war, the one where she tried to be lovable at the cost of her authenticity, that war is over. And she didn't lose it. She just laid down her weapons and walked away. That's not surrender. That's wisdom. People underestimate the strength it takes to pull back, to not react, to sit in the ache of absence and still choose not to chase it. But that's exactly where her power lives, in that restraint. She understands now that the person who truly values her won't need to be begged for time, for clarity, for consistency. So she redirects her attention, not out of pettiness, but out of principle. Because once you recognize what you deserve, everything that doesn't align with it starts to feel noisy, even offensive. And here's what's beautiful about it. When she stops trying to pull someone back, she finally gets the space to pull herself forward. She invests in her own emotional ecosystem. She reconnects with forgotten passions. She cultivates friendships that feel reciprocal. She reclaims her time. And something shifts in her aura, subtly at first, but undeniably. That desperate energy, that emotional chasing, it dissolves. And in its place, there's this calm, this magnetism. She becomes rooted. And from that rooted place, she no longer has to pursue affection. The right people feel drawn to her, not because she's trying harder, but because she's finally stopped trying so damn hard. There's a temptation, especially in moments of loss, to want to make someone understand what they've done, to show them what they threw away. But she lets go of that too. She doesn't need them to understand anymore. She doesn't need revenge or a second chance or a grand gesture. That version of herself, the one who needed closure, the one who rehearsed text messages in her head, the one who kept checking if he still watched her stories, she's gone. And in her place stands a woman who knows that silence is not emptiness, it's evidence of self-respect. And maybe he notices. Maybe he scrolls through old photos or rereads the conversations, wondering when she slipped away. Maybe it hits him that her name no longer pops up, that her presence no longer lingers. Maybe he realizes what her absence truly means. But by then, it doesn't matter, because she's not playing games. She's not waiting to be chased. She's simply moved on, and not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, entirely. This is what happens when a woman stops craving crumbs. She begins to feast on her own worth. She pours into herself without guilt. And from that place, she doesn't shrink or harden. She simply refines. She becomes intentional, discerning, and stunningly unbothered. That's the quiet power of choosing peace over performance. There's a certain elegance in how she reclaims herself. Not loudly, not in some grand spectacle of reinvention, but quietly, with intention. You see, after heartbreak, a high-value woman doesn't sit around waiting for someone else to rebuild her. She doesn't fantasize about being rescued. That era of helplessness, it's done. Instead, she rolls up her sleeves, not for revenge, not for attention, but for connection with herself, with her essence, with the version of her that may have been silenced, dulled, or contorted to fit someone else's idea of love. And that reconnection doesn't start with fireworks. It starts in the mundane. She starts showing up for herself in the small things. She wakes up earlier, not to post about it, but because discipline feels good. She makes her bed, tidies her space, takes walks in silence. She listens to the thoughts that used to be drowned out by someone else's noise. And in that silence, she rediscovers the sound of her own voice. That voice that used to be interrupted, doubted, second-guessed, it grows stronger, more sure. She starts taking herself seriously again, her ambitions, her routines, her health. These aren't distractions from heartbreak. They're the soil she's planting her rebirth in. She doesn't need to escape her feelings anymore. She lets them rise. She lets them ache. And then, like waves, they pass. Because she's learned the truth about emotion, it's not the enemy, it's the compass. It's what leads her back to what matters. Now the world will try to tempt her, and it'll tell her to numb out, to swipe left and right until her worth feels validated again. But she sees through it. She's not interested in replacing what hurt her with something that barely knows her. That's not healing. That's a detour. And she's done detouring. She's moving forward now, but with eyes wide open. Her time, her heart, her attention. They're not available for rent anymore. They're earned. And here's what's quietly powerful. When she gets serious about herself, everything starts to shift. The people who took her for granted sense the change, not because she says anything, but because her energy withdraws. The emotional labor she used to offer so freely, it's gone. The version of her that used to check in, follow up, over-explain, that version no longer picks up the phone. And it's not bitterness, clarity. She's no longer trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding her. She's too busy becoming, not for the world, not for applause, but for herself. And that kind of transformation, it doesn't scream. It doesn't post daily updates. It unfolds in the privacy of early mornings, in the discipline of choosing growth over comfort, in the integrity of holding boundaries that protect her peace. That's the work no one claps for. But it's also the work that changes everything. She begins to attract differently because now she's not sending out signals of lack. She's not looking to be filled up by anyone else. She's full, and people feel that. They feel her presence when she walks into a room, not because she's loud, but because she's whole. That energy, that sovereignty, it doesn't chase, it doesn't cling, it doesn't prove, it just is. And it commands a kind of respect that can't be faked. And make no mistake, she still remembers the pain, but she's no longer defined by it. She's not trying to erase the memories, she's integrating them. She understands now that heartbreak didn't break her, it revealed her. It carved out the parts of her that were still waiting for permission to shine. And now, she gives herself that permission daily. She stops comparing, she stops explaining, she stops needing anyone to validate the choices she's made to protect her heart, because she knows what it costs to arrive here, and she's not going back. That old life, the one filled with confusion, overthinking, self-doubt, that's no longer home. She's building a new one, brick by brick, day by day. Not built on fantasy or false promises, but on truth, on boundaries, on self-trust. And maybe, just maybe, the person who let her go starts to see the shift, starts to feel the absence of someone who used to be available for every emotional emergency. Maybe he wonders why the texts don't come anymore, why her name has faded from the notifications. But she's not waiting for him to notice. She's not living her life in the hopes of being missed. She's too occupied with becoming the kind of woman who doesn't need to be remembered to feel whole. She already is. And so she keeps rising, not because she has something to prove, but because it's simply who she is now. And that kind of woman, she doesn't chase, she doesn't compete, she doesn't beg, she simply moves forward and lets the silence speak. There comes a point in the aftermath of heartbreak when the external noise fades, the opinions, the distractions, the temptation to numb everything down with short-term pleasure or forced positivity. It all starts to fall away. And what remains is this quiet space, a kind of uncomfortable stillness where you're left with one person only, yourself. And for many, that's a terrifying place to be. But for the high-value woman, that's where the real work begins. That's where the real healing starts. Because when you've been emotionally gutted, betrayed, or even just disappointed by someone you gave your heart to, you realize there's only one thing left to do. Build from the inside out. She doesn't try to fill the void with someone new. That's a mistake people make over and over again, trying to replace a person instead of repairing the wound. But a high-value woman, a woman with self-awareness and emotional integrity, she knows better. She knows that if you don't heal it, you'll bleed all over someone who didn't cut you. So she doesn't mask the pain. She meets it. She sits with it. She asks it what it's trying to teach her. And what often gets revealed in that silence is brutal but liberating. Maybe she sees the patterns, how she ignored the red flags, how she compromised herself to keep someone else comfortable, how she abandoned her own intuition just to be loved. And those realizations, they sting, they're humbling, but they're also clarifying, because with every moment of self-reflection, she takes the power back. Not from him, but from her own unconsciousness. There's a strange kind of empowerment that comes from realizing you were complicit in your own suffering. Not because you deserved it, but because you allowed it. Because you were so desperate to be chosen that you forgot to choose yourself. And in that painful reckoning, she begins to make a new promise to herself. Never again. Never again will she lower her standards just to feel wanted. Never again will she chase someone who's emotionally unavailable. Never again will she mistake anxiety for chemistry or inconsistency for passion. She now understands what love is supposed to feel like, not just butterflies, but safety, not just excitement, but peace. And more importantly, she realizes that she has to become the kind of woman who aligns with that kind of love, because you can't attract what you aren't ready to receive. So, she starts showing up differently, for herself first. She learns to say no without guilt. She draws boundaries, not to punish others, but to protect her energy. She stops over-explaining her worth. She doesn't try to fix broken people anymore. She's not interested in potential, she's interested in reality. She knows now that someone's intentions mean nothing if their actions don't align. And here's the shift most people miss. When a woman truly reclaims herself after heartbreak, she doesn't just become harder, she becomes clearer. Her softness returns, but with discernment. She's not bitter, she's aware. She's not guarded, she's selective. That's the difference. She's not trying to avoid pain, she's just no longer inviting chaos. And that distinction changes the entire trajectory of her relationships. Now the people around her start to notice. She's glowing differently. Not because of a new relationship, but because of a new relationship with herself. She's stopped shrinking. She's stopped apologizing for her standards. She's owning her space, her voice, her desires. And that kind of woman, she's magnetic. Not in a desperate or performative way, but in a grounded, undeniable way. Because true self-respect has a frequency, and you can't fake it. You either have it, or you don't. And maybe the person who hurt her watches from a distance. Maybe he doesn't understand how she transformed so deeply in such silence. Maybe he wonders why the version of her that once longed for his validation has disappeared. But it doesn't matter. She's not performing for closure anymore. She's not hoping to be seen. She's seeing herself. And that right there is the turning point. Because the truth is, the journey back to wholeness isn't glamorous. It's not always inspiring. Sometimes it's lonely. Sometimes it's repetitive. But she does it anyway. Because she knows that nothing and no one is worth her losing herself again. And when a woman learns to love her own solitude, when she starts to enjoy her own company, when she no longer needs to be needed to feel valuable, she becomes unstoppable. She doesn't look for love anymore. She becomes love. And if someone shows up who's worthy of that, she'll let them in. But until then, she's content, not complacent, content, because she knows now that her happiness isn't on layaway. It's not dependent on someone else finally waking up and realizing what they lost. She's already found what matters her. And that kind of peace, that kind of alignment, it can't be taken away. It can only be matched. Most people assume that after a heartbreak, the way forward is about moving on, about getting over it, about forgetting. But that's a shallow way to look at it. A high-value woman doesn't just move on, she evolves. She doesn't erase the past, nor does she drown herself in distractions. She uses the wound as a mirror. And in doing that, she finds something far more valuable than a rebound or even closure. She finds her purpose. Purpose becomes the anchor in the storm. Because heartbreak, if you allow it, has a way of stripping you bare. It exposes the places where you were relying too heavily on someone else for your sense of worth, for your emotional security, for your direction. And once that person is gone, what you're left with is the terrifying realization that maybe you didn't know who you were outside of them. That's the part nobody warns you about. But for the woman who chooses to lean into that discomfort rather than escape it, the pain becomes fuel. She starts to ask better questions, not why did he leave or why wasn't I enough, but what am I meant to build now that this chapter is closed? And those questions unlock something powerful. They turn her gaze inward and forward, not backward. Suddenly she's not trying to get his attention. She's not trying to make him regret anything. She's trying to find what sets her on fire. She's chasing something real, something she can control, something that isn't dependent on anyone's approval or affection. This is where things begin to shift dramatically. Instead of staying stuck in the emotional quicksand, she puts her energy into something that grows. Maybe it's a business. Maybe it's a creative pursuit. Maybe it's a new philosophy on life that she starts to live out day by day. The specifics don't matter. What matters is that it's hers. It's not about impressing anyone. It's about fulfilling something internal that had been dormant for too long. When you see a woman who's channeling her heartbreak into her mission, she carries herself differently. There's a calm intensity in her eyes, not hardness, focus. She doesn't argue. She doesn't chase. She doesn't even waste time trying to be understood by those who don't want to understand her. She's simply too busy creating something meaningful out of the mess she was handed. That's the alchemy of a woman who has turned pain into purpose. She stops being reactive and starts being deliberate with her time, with her energy, with her relationships. And here's what's truly powerful. She starts to attract differently too, not just romantically, but across the board. When a woman starts living in alignment with her purpose, people notice. Not because she's loud about it, but because she's consistent. She's no longer seeking validation, so she becomes immune to manipulation. She doesn't need external drama to feel alive. Her fulfillment is internal. And people who thrive on chaos or control, they can't reach her anymore. She's simply operating on a different level. There's something almost sacred about watching someone become who they were meant to be after being broken. Because most don't. Most settle. Most fall into patterns. Most just try to survive the pain and move on with the same habits, the same mindset, the same wounds. But not her. She let the pain teach her. She let it strip away what was false. And now what remains is real. You see, purpose doesn't erase the heartbreak. It transcends it. It puts it in context. It says, this happened to me, but it's not the end of me. It's part of my becoming. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Now, instead of looking back in bitterness, she looks forward with clarity. And eventually, the wound isn't even a wound anymore. It becomes a scar, a reminder not of weakness, but of transformation. Of the day, she decided she wasn't going to be defined by what broke her, but by what she built from the pieces. And maybe the people who used to know her don't understand this version of her. Maybe they say she's changed. Maybe they miss the woman who was more pliable, more eager to please, more dependent. But that version of her had to die so this one could emerge. And no, she doesn't go around announcing her growth. She doesn't need to. The results speak for themselves. Her life speaks for itself. Her peace, her presence, her purpose, they're louder than any apology she never got, louder than any validation she used to crave, louder than the heartbreak itself. And so While some sit in silence, stuck in regret or what ifs, she's out there creating something eternal from something temporary. And that right there is the revenge that doesn't look like revenge at all. It looks like freedom. After heartbreak, many are tempted to prove their worth by showing how much they've moved on through images, stories, new relationships, or loud affirmations that they've never been better. But the truth is, genuine healing doesn't need a stage. It's not loud, it's quiet, and it's honest. A high-value woman doesn't seek attention to validate her recovery. She doesn't need to, because the path she walks now isn't performative, it's authentic. She's not chasing perception, she's cultivating peace. And that peace comes at a cost. You see, when someone you loved breaks you, there's this internal pull to fix what's been fractured. You want to make sense of the chaos. You want answers. You want justice. And if you're not careful, you'll get caught in this trap of needing them to see your worth before you can feel whole again. But that's not healing. That's bargaining with your dignity. The high-value woman lets go of that illusion. She doesn't need them to see anymore. She doesn't even need closure. She becomes the closure. This shift, while subtle, is seismic. Because when she stops needing to be seen by the one who hurt her, she starts seeing herself with a clarity that she never had before. And in that clarity, she reclaims her time, her energy, her attention. She takes all the hours she used to spend analyzing texts, replaying conversations, wondering what she could have done differently, and she redirects them into herself, into becoming not for anyone else, but for her. Because now she understands that the real loss wasn't him. It was the pieces of herself she gave away without asking why. Now she protects those pieces. And that's why she doesn't beg for validation anymore. That's why she doesn't send messages into the void hoping for some kind of acknowledgement. That's why she doesn't participate in the drama, because she knows what she's worth now. Not in a spiteful, arrogant way, but in a grounded, unshakable way. And when you know your worth on that level, silence becomes more powerful than any comeback, any display, any performance. And yes, that silence is deafening for the person who expected her to stay predictable. The one who thought she'd always be available. The one who assumed she would always respond, always explain herself, always make excuses for their absence. When she no longer gives them that, when she simply moves forward without fanfare, they're left with the void they created. And in that void, they feel the weight of her absence, not because she made a scene, but because she didn't. There is something almost haunting about that kind of departure. It's not angry, it's not bitter, it's just complete. And that's what makes it powerful, because when you leave with silence and certainty, there's no hook for them to pull you back with. They can't bait you into emotional chaos. They can't use confusion to keep you entangled. You've stepped out of the game entirely. You've exited the cycle. And for a woman who has rediscovered her value, that's where real power lies. This is what sets her apart, not just from who she used to be, but from the patterns that once governed her relationships. She's not trying to prove herself anymore. She's not trying to be chosen. She's choosing herself deliberately every single day. And that choice becomes a habit. That habit becomes a lifestyle. That lifestyle becomes a statement. I don't need you to see my growth for it to be real. And because she's no longer caught in the performance of healing, she can actually heal. She creates space in her life for things that nourish her. She surrounds herself with people who don't make her question her worth. She builds a life that reflects who she's becoming, not who she had to be for someone else. There's no race to replace the relationship. There's just the quiet, steady work of rebuilding the foundation she abandoned while loving someone who never really saw her. And it's in that quiet rebuilding where she becomes unrecognizable, not to the world, but to the version of herself that once settled. She looks back and can barely remember the woman who doubted her own instincts, who twisted herself into versions that made other people comfortable. That woman was necessary, but she's no longer needed. Now, there's a woman who stands on her own, not in defiance, but in peace. So when the memories come, when the pain flickers back, when the world tempts her to perform again, she reminds herself of how far she's come. Not to boast, not to prove, but to stay grounded, to stay aligned, to stay sovereign. Because that's what it means to truly move on. Not to announce it, not to showcase it, but to live it. And in that quiet transformation, she becomes someone even heartbreak couldn't touch.